Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now in our third season, and we continue to be as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we talk to experts for today's show on cities, built environment, and infrastructure. And, of course, we've been on that series all month. And today we're going to look and focus in on trees, urban nature spaces, and how they back up against houses, roads, and farms. You know, forests, which is where majority of the trees are today, are a very important part of any city in all of our lives. And they provide many, many environmental benefits and urban nature in all its forms. Actually, be that urban forest, parks, green belts. All of them provide a range of benefits and services to society, most of which cannot be readily bought and sold. In fact, economists have tried to calculate, I think in somewhat vain, the use value, as they say, of nature and its environment. And the use value, they mean putting a dollar amount on it, where goods can be bought and sold, such as when you can buy timber, which comes from forest, as well as fishery products. But those non-use values present a more complex economic conundrum. Because how can we estimate values for many of the indirect and, of course, intangible services and functions that our urban nature provides, that nature that we look out of our windows and see, such as beauty, green infrastructure, and psychological benefits as well. Trees in general, though, provide a large number of environmental benefits in our lives that we directly experience by having trees planted throughout our city and our yards and in our areas that we go back and forth on. And some of those benefits we experience that are carried out by the trees in our lives include removal of air pollutants, not just from the air, but also from the soil and the water. It includes release of water vapor into the atmosphere that tends to cool our surrounding areas, and it helps to mitigate that urban heat island effect that those in the high-density urban areas experience. They are an interception of rainfall and a reduction of storm water as it runs off in our cities. Trees represent an energy saving, and they reduce greenhouse gas emissions due to the shades that they provide. And they actually take out the carbon from the air. And what many of us experience is that increased property value that they provide. Now, in addition to the contribution of a lot of these services, trees also provide health benefits, social, economic, as well as the aesthetic beauty benefits, some of which we mentioned. The magnitude, though, of the benefits that these trees and the tree systems provide, though, are tied to their age and their size, as well as the condition. The bigger they are, the more benefits to our environment and to us that they're providing. The smaller, the less. Ideally, though, an urban forest is going to be comprised of trees of various ages and, again, various sizes. This is going to be the most helpful. The World Wildlife Foundation says, in fact, that trees are truly a beautiful part of the natural environment, but they are also amazingly efficient machines, they call them, constantly working to make Earth a healthier place. That is for humans as well as the animals, which they're concerned about. So then, we ask, when must we as a society or the world society ask ourselves, what's the value to us of trees in urban nature areas? What's in it for us in order that we can aggressively regulate the ratios of trees and forest, houses, roads, and farms in our built environment for now and the future? So now this is a lot to ponder, but here today to help us unpack this and try to understand more about this friction maybe of trees, urban spaces, nature spaces up against houses, roads, and farms are three very learned people. We have with us today Rachel Comte from Urban Canopy Works, Mike Galvin with the group Save a Tree, and Neil Vora with Conservation International, all from varying disciplines who are going to help us understand this. Now, Rachel is an arborist, and she's an urban planner and an expert with Urban Canopy Works. She's a leading authority today on urban forestry master plans, and she's consulted with cities across the United States, and she's got over 20 years of combined experience in this field. Welcome, Rachel. We're so glad you could join us today, and did I get that right?
You did. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And Mike Galvin is a director of the Save a Tree Consulting Group, and they provide arbor-cultural consulting services to clients across the country. And his expertise is the Natural Resources Consulting Group. Mike, at one time, too, was deputy director of the NGO Casey Trees, and he spent over 2 decades as a municipal arborist. Welcome, Mike, and did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did. Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And our other guest is Neil Vora. Neil is with Conservation International. He is a physician with Conservation International, where he leads its efforts on pandemic prevention. He served for nearly a decade with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, CDC. As well, Neil developed and led New York City's COVID-19 contact tracing program, and he's published a number of articles. Welcome, Neil. We are so glad you could carve out time as well to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm excited to jump into this with all of you experts who have looked at and studied all of these interactions for a long time. So I want to start out with Rachel. Rachel, will you talk to our listeners about what the term tree canopy means and what are these services or environmental benefits or other services that trees provide for our environment?
Thank you. So I want to back up just a second and define an urban forest as well, because a lot of people don't necessarily know what that is. So that's a term used to describe all the trees within a city, and that spans across private and public lands, on parks, streets, campuses, people's backyards, the whole range. So when we talk about urban forests, we're really just talking about trees in cities. So I want to clarify.
Yeah, let me ask you something on that, because there are some areas in North Texas is one of them where we do have a giant, I think we have like about a 6,000 acre Great Trinity Forest that abuts our urban city. And that's what we here would refer to as an urban forest.
Yeah.
So is there another name for something like that?
I think what we would say is that's probably a naturalized woodland within an urban forest. It's part of it, certainly.
Okay,
yeah,
got it.
We tend to run into people who think, well, I don't live near a forest because I live in Manhattan and I don't, well, that's not Central Park, but it's all considered a system.
Indeed, yeah, and I think I've seen people refer to that as the urban nature space, because it could take many different shapes and sizes. Yeah, we did a study here several years back where we identified about 15 urban nature spaces in the North Texas area, and they range from about 5 acres, I think, to the 6,000 acre one that we had. Yeah.
But even your street tree in front of your house, if you live in an urban area, that's part of the urban forest, even if it's one tree by itself. And then to define tree canopy, yeah, we use that term a lot. It's what we're referring to is if you look at a city or community from an aerial view, think of Google aerial imagery, and that's the amount of land that's covered with a tree, leaves and branches during the summer when the leaves are on, expressed in a percentage. So we know that in Boston, 27% of Boston is covered with tree canopy when viewed from above. You know, Cincinnati, where I live, has 39%. Charlotte has 45%. So it's a way to measure the amount of trees, not quantity of individual trees, but the amount of tree cover in a city. And it's also a way to measure and track where changes are occurring. So you could look at tree canopy cover in your city today, and then look at tree canopy cover 10 years ago, and start to see where are the gains and losses happening and why. It's a metric that we use.
Indeed. Well, thank you for helping us to understand that. And you've also covered, too, why they are important, because people are hearing a lot of talk about tree canopy these days. And what we want to certainly impress upon our audience is why they should care about that. And so I want to move now to Mike. Why should people care about tree canopies? And what are the connections between trees and people's health?
Well, you made a comment at the beginning about the built environment, and the built environment is important to us all. We need to have transportation and recreation, and we have to have places to work and live. But we certainly also need the natural environment and keep that as undisturbed and as in harmony as possible with the built environment. Trees do things like, as you said at the outset, which was great, mitigate the heat island effect, intercept pollution. EPA uses soot and smog as the kind of two big pollutants that they talk about, and the soot is PM 2.5. It's particulate matter that's 2.5 microns across. You may have seen some things in the news recently about how air pollution and COVID kind of exacerbate each other, and some people had worse COVID outcomes because of the problems that they had from ingesting air pollution.
Yeah, trees are really important, and there's much more. We're going to go to break, though, and when we come back from the break, we will reconvene or reconnect with Mike to finish telling us that connection of why we should care about trees and tree canopy and what's in it for us, i.e. our health. Thank you so much. We'll be right back on the other side. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening, plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to the last show in our series on cities, built environment, and infrastructure. And today we're focusing in on trees and urban forest and urban nature spaces versus housing, roads, and farms. And we are back today with Rachel Comte with Urban Canopy Works, Mike Galvin with Save a Tree, and Neil Vora with Conservation International. And right before the break, Mike had begun to tell us a little about the connection between trees and health, and why we should really care about trees and tree canopy.
Trees are really important to people's well-being and state of mind, in addition to their actual physical health. There are some doctors that use a program called Trees RX, and they prescribe for patients to actually spend time in parks to improve their health. So it's super important there. Trees, of course, on a real kind of base sense, we talked about property values. Trees do add value to property. It's really important to note that in some communities, this isn't always viewed as an asset. Trees, unfortunately, are often not distributed evenly across cities. And sometimes people feel like it's a precursor to gentrification when a tree planting initiative comes into their city. This caused because rising property values may not always be a positive thing to some folks. And unfortunately, in the past, some tree planting efforts have been associated with community groups that had very negative aspects to them, trying to keep certain types of people out of their communities. So there are some negative associations with those kinds of tree planting efforts that we have to overcome. I worked for a long time in the city of Baltimore for a few decades, and there were community improvement associations in the early 1900s in Baltimore that did tree planting. They also kept Jews, people of color, Irish out of certain neighborhoods. And so people had grandparents who were around when those things happen, and they can have those associations, and it can prevent people from wanting to accept tree planting efforts in their communities. So it's really difficult, and it's important to get tree canopy increased in communities where there's a lot of multifamily housing and people may not have climate control in their house, because the natural disaster that most people face morbidity and mortality from in the United States annually is heat. It's not tornadoes, it's not hurricanes, it's not floods, it's heat. So really important that those folks get access to the shade so they can be comfortable when it's hot and they don't have an air-conditioned house to go to.
Indeed, Mike. And as I listen to you, I realized something that I want Rachel to comment on here, too, and then we're going to move on, because I know both of you all are involved in working with what seems to be a new and very big movement among cities, is to do the tree master plan. And as I listen to you talk about the issues you just discussed, those are primarily seem to be attributable to some of your, I suppose, mostly northern, but very dense urban neighborhoods, as opposed to us here in North Texas, as well as some other areas where we have trees, we have places to plant them.
Work in Tallahassee and in Charlotte and Columbus and a lot of cities that aren't as dense as some of the Northeast cities that I've worked in, and the problems might be, or the challenges, I'll say, might be a little bit different, but the importance of trees and all of these cities are growing, and so they're experiencing densification, which often means a house that might have been on a half-acre lot, like a little Cape Cod house, is being bought and torn down and built into 7 townhouses. So as they're becoming denser, they're losing tree canopy. So every city is a little bit different in what their challenges are, but cities are getting hotter and the populations are growing, which means getting denser, which means canopy is being lost right at a time when we need it the most because of the public health, because of the heat reduction combined with the air pollution. Trees remove up to 60% of street level air pollution. Those two things together have huge impacts on public health, which I'm sure Neil knows way more about than I do. I apply the findings from all these studies. Neil probably has done these studies, but
indeed, and then again, but that's what I wanted to bring out is the importance of the trees, and then I want to move very briefly to: is there any way? Are there any harms that we're seeing trees that are causing the environment because of this vicious circle or loop? What are the potential harms trees can cause to the environment and to health?
There's infrastructure conflicts when you have trees in cities. Oftentimes the street trees are planted next to sidewalks, and they're always in conflict. That area between the sidewalk and the street, we call a tree lawn. It's got different terms in different parts of the country, but you'd love to have a 10-foot tree lawn. 10-foot, a lot of times you only have 3 feet or 4 feet, and so you end up with trees damaging sidewalks, and then who's going to pay for that? And so there's a balance. I think right now a lot of people aren't connecting the value and the role that trees play in cities. So right now they're saying, well, you put a tree in front of my house and now I have to replace the sidewalk. I don't want this. Not seeing the bigger picture of kids having less asthma and better mental health and all of the benefits that we could spend a whole hour just talking about the benefits.
Yeah, like I said, I guess it really is a problem in those very heavily congested and highly dense places, having places to put the trees. And I guess the good news is that the places that don't yet look like that have realized the challenges. And so they're the ones, being proactive by doing their tree master plans.
And for example, Charlotte is dealing with an urban core that has been planted with these beautiful oaks 100 years ago. And so they have these beautiful tree-lined streets in their older urban core. The problem they're dealing with is they're all aging out at the same time. They have a set lifespan. Mm-hmm. So now they're dealing with, okay, we want to add canopy in areas that are getting, trees are getting cut down for subdivisions. But also we know we have this huge expense coming to take these oaks down as they become public safety issues. And so that's a lot of money just being spent on tree care and management. And that's going to be a significant loss for those areas. And so they're trying to make plans for the future.
Indeed. And one last question on this, and I keep saying that, but one last question on this, and I do want to go to Neil so we can talk about the health aspects of it. But it appears to me that a motivator could be a motivator that could be quickly seen and experienced with people in terms of why should we have more trees is the energy cost. But it also strikes me, too, that, again, for those very congested urban areas, it just may not be possible. But I know a couple of years back when we had a severe storm here in North Texas, I had like 4 trees on top of my house. They didn't damage the roof because they were all from next door. And one of the things my neighbor and I noticed a few months later when it began to be hot in summer is like she noticed a very significant difference in her energy bill. Yeah. She had like these 4 huge trees that covered all her yard and mine too.
Trees are city infrastructure, which means they require care and management. They're not carefree, cost-free. They do fail. They are, it's not as common as people think. There's a big fear factor of people saying, "Oh, I'm scared this is going to fall on my house," without talking to a certified arborist to determine whether that's a risk there or not. Going back to the energy savings piece, the cooling effect of 1 healthy tree is equivalent to 10 room-size air conditioners operating just 1 tree. So this is very, the cost savings is important to all of us. But in a low-income household where they have a higher energy burden, meaning they spend a larger portion of their income on home energy costs, they 3 times more than other households. If a well-placed tree can save 60% of AC costs during the day, imagine what an impact that has on a low-income household. That might be the difference that month, having to choose between paying your energy bills or buying food or medicine or other essentials.
So let me ask you, that seems like a quick and easy fix for people who have a yard and have the right to plant some trees. So whose job is it to push that message?
Well, in cities, typically, not in some of the larger cities like in Manhattan or whatever, but in 70 to 80% of tree canopy is on private land. So when we talk about growing tree canopy in cities, a lot of it goes to that. And so really that's an education, and the cities can lead by example by planting the areas that they control and streets and parks and helping to educate the public. But there's more work that needs to be done, and I think that's the challenging piece to our work. I don't know if Mike is...
Yeah, we go you briefly, Mike, and then we're going to go to break, and then we're going to come back from the break talking to Neil about the health aspects of all of this. Go ahead, Mike.
There's certainly a role for agencies like HUD and state departments of housing and community development to help people in public housing. And on the private sector, of course, there's also multifamily housing that could benefit from greening and keeping those cooling costs down. And that, of course, reduces emissions, as we've discussed before, reduces pollution, it sequesters carbon, less carbon emitted into the atmosphere, so it's a win-win all the way around.
Yeah, indeed. I know it's there is some degree of effectiveness on the municipal code side. In my other life as in real estate development, like in Austin, Texas, you have to take the measurement of all the trees on the property, and certain trees you just cannot remove, and other trees, if you remove them, you have to replace them on the property. And that's effective, too. And so I think, like you said, some of the other ways is how can we incentivize homeowners, and especially letting them know the cost. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and go to break. And we'll be right back on the other side with these 3 experts who really are making us smarter. We have been with Rachel Comte with Urban Canopy Works, Mike Galvin with Save a Tree, and Neil Vora with Conservation International. We'll be right back on the other side of the break. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on cities, built environment, and infrastructure, as we focus in today on trees, urban nature spaces versus houses, roads, and farms. And we're back with 3 very smart people who are making us smarter about why we really must care about trees and urban forests in our environment and how very essential they are for our health. And so we're going to start back with Neil Vora with Conservation International, whose expertise is more so on the health side of this. Neil is a physician, and I think Neil was involved with what I think is a very significant report that's out there called the Spillover Report that was done by the Harvard Chin School. And he's going to tell us about that. But I want to start out, Neil, with something that probably we may have brought up in the other part of the show, and that is, what is the nexus or the interrelationship among trees or tree canopy and animals and humans?
Thanks, Bernice. And there's so much to say on the health benefits of forests that we get from forests. We've heard a bit about this from Rachel and Mike, and I fully agree with those comments. But first of all, people need nature to survive. Everything we get as humans materially ultimately comes from nature. And so we get so many goods and products and materials from nature, including medicines, for example. There are a number of medicines that are derived from compounds that are from nature, in particular from forests. And so that's just one example. Beyond that, though, forests and trees are important for prevention of a range of different health conditions. I focus on infectious diseases. That is my background, and happy to dive into that further. But forests are a very important part of our defense against emerging infectious diseases. And beyond that, we benefit from the preventative aspects that forests and trees provide, because trees and forests are essential for climate change mitigation. And climate change is probably the greatest health threat that we face in the coming century. And beyond that, we are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, and we need forests if we want to conserve the biodiversity that we have on this planet. And there are just indescribable health benefits of forests. And finally, I would just add that forests and trees help us heal. We need forests for our mental health and for a variety of different benefits that forests and trees provide provide us when healing from non-communicable diseases.
Indeed, and I think people are finally beginning to wake up to that fact. Now, Neil, you mentioned that we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. What does that mean? Who or what's going extinct right about now?
So, prior to the arrival of humans on the world, there have been 5 other mass extinction events from a variety of different causes. One of those mass extinctions was when an asteroid hit the Earth and basically led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, currently, humans are the driving factor of the 6th mass extinction, where we are seeing unprecedented losses of species and other forms of biodiversity. And when I say the term biodiversity, that means the diversity of life on this planet, all the way from the genetic components, all the way to the species level, and also culture, for example, right? So people, many different cultures depend upon nature for their cultural identity. And even those cultures are at risk of endangerment and extinction because of what is happening to nature right now. And so we are in the midst of this 6th mass extinction driven by human activities, particularly the loss of natural habitats such as forests, also climate change and invasive species and beyond. And I'm sure Rachel and Mike can add to that as well.
Now, Neil, you were, I think, one of the authors of the Spillover Report. And so can you explain to us what this report means, what its purposes are, and what was the impetus for undertaking that?
There have been a number of scientists and other experts who've studied infectious diseases going back hundreds of years, and these studies have shown that infectious disease transmission is affected by our relationship between our interactions with nature and animals. You said that before, Bernice, that there's this unbreakable link between humans and nature, and I fully agree with that. Now, we know also that since the 1940s, new infectious diseases and old infectious diseases as well have been on the rise. We call these emerging infectious diseases. And most of these emerging infectious diseases originate from animals, particularly wildlife. And the reason they are on the rise is because of these new forms of human interactions with wildlife and domestic animals that are putting us in contact with other species in ways that are unsafe, that allow microbes like bacteria and viruses to jump from animal species into people. And this has grave consequences. These types of species jumps of pathogens are not random events that affect people in remote corners of the world. In fact, they have worldwide cataclysmic impacts because since 1918, there have been 6 pandemics, and 5 of those 6 pandemics for sure were the result of that spillover of animal pathogens into people, and probably the 6th one, COVID, was also the result of that spillover.
So most of us know about COVID. What were the other 5?
So there have been 4 influenza pandemics. Some people, some of your listeners might remember the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, but before that, there were 3 other influenza pandemics since 1918, right? So that's 4 of them. And then the 5th one was HIV, which probably emerged in humans through multiple spillover events throughout the 20th century. But then in the late 70s through the 80s, transmission really started to increase, and HIV infections became apparent to humans. And again, that HIV originated from some animal source that then jumped over into people. And then the 6th one is COVID-19. And again, most experts, including myself, believe that COVID originated because of such a spillover event. The evidence that we have available strongly suggests that.
Where are we saying is the originator with animal species for COVID?
So there's a lot of evidence that a number of viruses related to the virus that causes COVID circulate in bats. And so probably the virus that causes COVID originated in bats, and then most likely, again, because of the trade in wildlife through live wildlife markets and trade, again, created an opportunity for wildlife pathogens to jump into maybe an intermediate domestic animal species or directly into humans. Again, we don't have all the dots firmly pointed out, but there are other examples of this. And one that's very relevant right now, some of the listeners might have heard about the ongoing monkeypox virus outbreak that's happening in the world.
Yes.
Well, there was a big monkeypox virus here in the outbreak here in the United States in 2003 in the Midwest related to the importation of rodents from Africa as part of the pet trade. And so that was an example all the way back nearly 20 years ago of how this movement of wildlife resulted in an outbreak of a potentially very dangerous disease. And this underscores why we need to think about our connection to nature and how our disturbances of nature can lead to very adverse health impacts for people.
That is a lot. And I think certainly that's one of the aims of Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio is to help people explore and understand this. And you are bringing it home very clearly, that is what really the term spillover means, is the spillover, pathogens and disease from the animal species to the human species. And in the middle of that spillover, or the conduit, is nature, urban nature, forest, trees, all of that.
Wait, can I just add one thing? It's actually, just to be clear, it's not that nature is the problem. It's when humans interact with nature and actually that active process of destroying nature that creates the risk, right? So biodiversity in itself is not a bad thing. Actually, biodiversity can be very protective against infectious diseases. But when we as humans clear that biodiversity through deforestation, building roads, urbanization, we then create the opportunities for spillover to happen. We create the conditions for bad health outcomes to occur because of what we are doing to nature. But nature itself is not the issue.
Not nature, but when we clear out or do not respect our urban nature spaces, that is a bad thing. And basically that's another reason why urban nature spaces are good and we need to fight to have them, is because they do help to maintain that biodiversity that we need, as well as really the buffer between that animal community. That's what I mean. Nature is in the middle of it. It's that buffer. It's the habitat of that animal community. The more we have of it, then the more the animal community can stay in their community, and their issues don't have to spill over to ours. So it really is all very, very interconnected, and that's what we want to make people understand. And certainly those health consequences are one of those driving forces or driving reasons why it is critical that people do understand. Now, when we come back, I want to delve a little bit more into infectious diseases in terms of how it might also come from trees and forests to to the human population. So we'll be right back on the other side of the break with these three very smart people who are making us smarter. We've been with Rachel Comte with Urban Canopy Works, Mike Galvin with Save a Tree, and Neil Vora with Conservation International. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body, none mercury. And specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to our last show in our series on cities, built environment, and infrastructure. And today we're talking to experts about trees and tree canopy, urban nature spaces versus houses, roads, and farms, and how that intersects or impacts our built environment and our health. And they've really been making us smarter about all of this. And I want to go back to Neil Vora with Conservation International, who was talking to us before the break about the spillover report and his work on that, being that spillover of issues and diseases from the animal population to our human population, as is believed COVID is, but as they have determined has happened in a number of instances in the past. And so, Neil, I want to talk now, though, about the connection between the spillover effects and climate change. Connect those dots for us, and if there's anything emerging or on the horizon right now that we're looking at or that we are concerned about.
There's several connections between climate change and infectious diseases. And so, first of all, as the world's average temperature increases, we might see more transmission of waterborne and foodborne diseases, just like we use refrigerators to keep our food and our beverages from rotting. Well, there are many parts of the world that don't have access to that refrigeration to the same extent that as we might have in the United States. And with a warming temperature, then there might be more transmission of such food and waterborne diseases. Second of all, there are a number of diseases called vector-borne diseases that are transmitted by insects or other arthropods, such as mosquitoes or ticks. And as the world's temperature rises, the habitat ranges of such vectors might also change. So, for example, we might see an expansion in the range of certain types of ticks here in the United States that are capable of transmitting Lyme disease. Third of all, we might see an expansion in the range of fungal diseases because of climate change, because, again, as the temperature rises, we might see fungal diseases having a wider range with which they can be found naturally occurring. An example of that might be coccidiomycosis, which is unfortunately relatively common in southwestern United States and might become increasingly common.
What is that, and what does it cause?
Coccidiomycosis is a fungal disease that can cause very severe disease in people who have suppressed immune systems or people who are pregnant. And so it can even go to the brain, for example, causing devastating disease. And beyond that, more recently, just in the last month or so, a major research study came out that showed that because of climate change, certain animal species are going to have to move in terms of where they live to find more favorable conditions. And some of those very species that will move, such as bats, are the same species that are known to harbor certain very dangerous viruses. And so because as they move, they might move their viruses with them and move them into places where people can be found. But again, I want to be clear that these animals in and of themselves are not bad. You know, bats might get vilified because
They do.
Yeah, they do. But we rely on bats for so many benefits that they provide, such as vector control. Again, going back to the example of vector-borne diseases, some species of bats eat insects, such as mosquitoes, and that helps prevent mosquito-borne diseases. And another thing that bats do that's very important is that some bat species are pollinators, and we need that for healthy vegetation.
What a conundrum.
But it's not a conundrum if we take care of nature, actually, right? When we take care of nature, we're taking care of ourselves, and we need to have a healthy respect for the other species with which we share the planet. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
But with that, as we approach the end of our last segment, I want to ask you, so what can people do? What can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
So first of all, we can take individual actions, with our food choices and our energy choices and our transportation choices. But I think at the bigger level, because individual action is one thing, but what we need to also see is system level changes, and that comes from voting. We need to put our vote towards politicians and towards policymakers who are going to be enacting policies based on evidence and based on what's good for us. And there's many different considerations when it comes to voting, but again, that is one of the most powerful ways to enact change.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate that. And now I want to move back to Mike. I want you to help to connect the dots for our listeners, though. How do trees help to mitigate climate change? And before that, what is climate change doing to trees? Because I think that's one of those circular issues, too, like the thing that Neil just gave us with bats.
Well, yes, exactly. In the same way that Neil talked about animal species, climate change is affecting the habitat ranges of certain plants. So as the warming occurs, they're seeing certain tree species in the forest move further north. And, of course, this affects the whole system because there are things that live in that forest. And if the forest moves, they move as well. So the impacts are really huge. There are also insect outbreaks. The West has experienced severe beetle outbreaks that are unlike anything it's ever seen before because of the effects of climate change, how it's stressing out the coniferous forest there and allowing the beetle population there to expand greatly. So these things have huge, huge impacts to each other. Now, we talked earlier about how trees sequester carbon. It's pretty well known now. That's been communicated great, how protecting trees and planting more forests can help sequester carbon that's in the atmosphere and help mitigate climate change. Also, as Rachel talked about earlier, reducing emissions by shading and giving us more comfort and protection in our homes so we need less artificial climate control. These are two of the biggest ways, mitigating the heat island effect so people can stay cool and be outside in the city, and reducing by intercepting airborne pollutants is another huge impact that trees can make.
But are we seeing, how can I say it? The tree population or the tree canopy is already under stress. Or what would you say is probably the most persistent or damaging harm that climate change is doing?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing a lot is climate change is making many precipitation events, not necessarily that the volume is bigger, but that they're happening over a shorter period of time and are much more intense. So it's like I usually say, you can't drink a couple of gallons of water today and then wait a month and drink a couple of gallons. You need some water as you go all along the way. And as we have these, drier periods with these really intense precipitation events in between, there really isn't time for that water to be absorbed properly into the soil and for the trees to get the benefit out of it that they would out of a much more well-distributed, slower precipitation event. And that's something we're seeing with climate change a lot.
And then fires. Do we have any sense the damage or amount of trees that we've lost due to our fires over the last few years?
Well, the last year was the biggest fire year ever, and unfortunately that's something that's said every year. But all these things go into each other. We have the drought in the West, hotter, drier conditions, more beetle activity, more dead wood, creates bigger fuels when the forest fires occurs, and it's just like a negative feedback loop that keeps feeding on itself.
And last word for you, Mike, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
Well, as Rachel said, most of the tree canopy in any city is on residential private property. So if you have a tree, care for it. If you don't have one, plant one. Some people may not have an opportunity, as you noted earlier, to plant a tree where they live. So they may volunteer for an NGO and help go plant trees at a local school or library and do something in the community if they don't have, land to plant trees where they live.
Last word, Rachel, before we have to come to an end. Your last words. What can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
When we work with cities, by the time we get to a city and they're struggling and they're dealing with resource issues and they know they're losing canopy, and so we come in at a time to help them start to problem solve. But a lot of times we've been brought in because the community has told the city that they want this. So if you can get involved in your city or just start advocating that trees and green space is really important in your city and you want this, that's often what tips the next steps for the city, is having the community say, we want this.
Indeed. And I would like to see maybe our utility company put an insert in there, too, says plant a tree today and save X amount approximately on your utility bill from the shed. That's a perfect place to catch people's attention. So from the policy standpoint or the programmatic standpoint, we'll have to work on that. Thank you so much, though. I really appreciate all of y'all taking time from your busy schedules to join us. We have been with Rachel Comte, who is with Urban Canopy Works. She is a lifelong arborist. We've been with Mike Galvin, also an arborist with Save a Tree Consulting, and with Neil Vora, who is a physician with Conservation International. And they have really answered some of those questions we pondered at the beginning, but certainly made us smarter about why it's not an option for us to care about the trees out there, the tree canopy, and that we have to be attuned to that tension between trees, urban nature spaces, and houses, roads, and farms, and sometimes ourselves. So thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of a trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourself. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening today, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. Thank you.